thank you for having me back, and thank you for being an interactive audience. Thank you for all the volunteers last time. There won't be any volunteers needed this time, you'll be pleased to know, so you can relax. I was talking to one of the people here about dark matter, and it is quite hard to get your head around it, isn't it, that there's such a strong belief. There is obviously some reasons for that belief, but there's such a strong belief in something that no one's directly tested. It's almost like having a strong belief in an imaginary friend in some ways, but once again, there may well be dark matter in the end, but it is exactly what it is. It's hidden, can't touch it, you can't feel it, no one's got anything for it. What I find interesting about dark matter, I remember one of my colleagues telling me how certain she was that she believed it. Now, she's not a physicist, like I'm not a physicist, she's not a mathematician, but she wholeheartedly believed it. Why did she believe it? Because some scientists said it. Now, that's why what I do at these talks is to show you the evidence so you can make up your own minds. And that's what I did in my book, Echoes of Jesus. It's all about showing people the evidence rather than just a bunch of quotes from professors. And of course, it's a good ride when you do it this way. You get to learn about graffiti and toilets and all sorts of things. So, this next talk is about longevity, the fact that in the Bible, it talks about people living long periods of time. We're going to be talking about death. In the extension of this talk, we're going to be talking about cancer and disabilities that children might be born with. Now, I'm aware that many of us have been touched by death. We've either had spouses die, or parents die, or children die, best friends commit suicide, whatever. This isn't a talk about how to cope with that and where God is in terms of your emotions and being comforted. This is a talk more about the facts of what from a biblical point of view. Great, fantastic. There's just some resources if you want to go a bit deeper. Much of what I present, you'll find something related to it on those resources. But generally I always go to the primary references wherever I can. This is a statement from a person who died, unfortunately, in about 2015, Walter B. Praveen. He was a professor of the history and philosophy of science. And you can see the words there are quite strong. So he says there are no gods. When he as a scientist who studied the philosophy of science, who was committed to the idea that there is no God, that all there is stuff. You know, if there is no God and no spirit world, all there is chemistry and physics and stuff. And that's what he believed very strongly. So he said there are no gods, there are no purposes, there is no life after death, there is no ultimate foundation for ethics, there is no ultimate meaning to life, and there's no free will for humans. You put on your black shirt this morning because your chemistry told you to. You might have thought you had a say in it, but you didn't really. It's all determined by your chemistry and your physics. So why I brought this up is that if you are a committed atheist, asking why is there death is a silly question, because they don't believe there's any reason to why it's so special about life. Life doesn't have a meaning. We're going to look at what the Bible says about the origin of death. So last week we talked about how do we know that Genesis is a historical narrative, it's telling us true history. Many of you will know that God created the world, according to Genesis, perfect. And this is foundationally important. Some religions believe that God is both evil and good at the same time. So their God has no trouble with doing something horrible, like intentionally creating a world full of death and doing it over billions of years, because their God has that part of it as its essence. Some other religions believe that there are two gods. There's always a good God and always a bad God. They're like good cop, bad cop. They never go away from each other. And that's their belief. But Christianity, the Bible teaches us that God is, in his essence, perfectly good, and that's one of the foundational reasons for believing that when he made the world, it was perfectly good. It wasn't full of disease and death, and it didn't come about over billions of years of death and suffering. So many of you will know that God created life, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve sinned, and as a result of that sin they were punished, and that was the onset of death. So in Genesis 2:17 they're being told that in dying they will die. That's what it actually says in the Hebrew. When God said, well, you've disobeyed me, in our English versions it doesn't translate the idiom, but in Hebrew the idiom is, in dying you shall die. You know how we have idioms, she'll be apples, no flies on my back, yeah, she's cool. So our Bibles don't translate idioms because they wouldn't make any sense. But when God said, okay, you've sinned, you've disobeyed me, your punishment is, in dying you shall die. And that's why, that's a statement of certainty, not a statement of immediateness. So we see this in Numbers chapter 26, verse 65. The Israelites had spent 40 years wandering around in the desert and dying off one by one. And God in Numbers chapter 26, 65 is narrating how he told them 40 years before that because of sin, in dying they shall die. Now, they didn't all die straight away, did they? It took 40 years for them all to die. So that statement is a statement of certainty, not a statement of instant action. And that is why when they sinned and God said you will die, they didn't die then and there. Of course, the statement wasn't meaning to say they'll die there and then at that point in time, thankfully, because they didn't have any kids at that stage. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have Yoda. So, and then of course, it made it clear that from dust we came and dust we will return. We didn't come from another organism, another animal, we came from dust. So that's the story of death. Now, it's reasonable to understand that if we were originally made to live forever, originally made with no death, that we were actually made to live forever. I've never heard anyone say this in church in a sermon, but that is the obvious implication or inference from the Bible. The first humans were meant to live forever. Now, and this was a common teaching throughout Christian history. So Basil of Caesaria from Turkey, he was born about 330 AD. He was a big teacher. He taught that first humans were going to live forever. If we fast forward to Martin Luther, where we get the Lutheran Church from, he was born in 1483. He was born in Germany. He was teaching loud and clear. First humans were made to live forever. And then for us Protestants here, there's John Wesley, who started a Methodist church. He was born much later again in 1703. He also taught this. So it's just a normal part of biblical teaching that it hadn't been for Adam and Eve sinning, people would have lived forever. But they did sin, and they did eventually die. But now it's easy to understand that if they were meant to live forever, the first ones would probably live for a very long time. In fact, for the first 1,500 years of biblical history, the average age of people dying, leaving out Enoch, is 912 years. That was the average age that they died. They all lived for nearly 1,000 years. This meant there was great overlap between subsequent and distant generations. So much so that Adam could have been telling Methuselah for 240 years what a mess he had made of things. How he shouldn't have listened to Eve, he should have obeyed God. He could have been telling Methuselah that story, that woe, for 240 years. Now, Methuselah lived so long that he overlapped with a guy called Shem for 90 years. So he could have been telling Shem, don't be stupid like Adam. Adam told me for 240 years, I did something stupid, you'll live to regret it, don't do it. So he could have been telling Methuselah, and Methuselah told Shem for 90 years about how everything happened. So that's a really interesting side effect, if you like, of people living long periods of time. We talked about this fellow before, Dr. John Sanford, the professor from Cornel University, professor in genetics and botany. He became a Christian later in life. He grew up and started his research as a scientist being an atheist. He had no trouble believing in evolution. He thought when he died that would be the end of it. But then he started to see for himself the information we've been talking about, and also that our genetic codes are decaying. We talked about that big double helix with the 3,200 million letters up one side and down the other, another 3,200. That is actually breaking down. So my kids have 100 more mutations than I do. And their kids will have my 100 mutation mistakes as well as their own new 100. So in other words, when the DNA is copied, when we make new humans, the DNA of ours, so some from the man, some from the woman, they get replicated and there are mistakes made in the copying. And this is called genetic decay or genetic entropy. It's happening to all living creatures. All of genomes are decaying because of these mistakes in the copying. And what he looked at is there any understanding about why it is that after the flood, people started to live much shorter? Some of the original inhabitants on the ark, they still lived long, but even Shem himself only lived 600, but the preceding generations for 1,500 generally lived for 900. So he's already a short living person, not a short liver, a short living person. And over time, the next generations, the lifespans get shorter and shorter and shorter very quickly. You can see that curve. So he pondered this. And this is a little bit of biology that some of you might find uncomfortable, but this is what he puts it down to. This is his model. Women are born with eggs. So all you girls here, when you came out of your mother's womb, you had ova. And you had all the ova you were ever going to have. So if you ever get married and have children, those children are born from eggs that you had when you were born. But us men, it's very different. Us men have sperm. And our sperm need to keep on being copied and copied and copied. So you imagine you got one sperm and then you photocopy it, and then that photocopy you then copy, and then that photocopy you copy, and that photocopy you copy. So that's why you really want to meet a young man when you have kids, because if he's an old man, there's been a lot more copying. So by the time a man is 50, the photocopying has gone on for 840 times. So the chance of old men having children with mutations is much higher. And so when people tell me, I met some friends in Sydney recently, they knew some friends, a man who got married in his 70s, and he had kids in his 70s. And they were saying how great it was. And all I was thinking is, that's like drink driving. It's risky behaviour for the kids' sake. And also I feel sorry for the kids. You're deliberately having children knowing you're not going to be around for very long, and typically. So we got this decay curve here. Now what's fascinating is that how could that data, remember it's in the Bible, could that data get there unless it was real? So some people say, oh, that could have been fake news, John. Someone could have come along in the Bible and they made up these stories and they just made the ages up as they went along. But that would be fake news, wouldn't it? And fake news wouldn't have a pattern that looks like a biological, exponential, mathematically defined decay curve. It's such a good curve that all the dots, the mathematical formula that describes that, accounts for 96% of the variation. In other words, most of the dots are where they should be according to a mathematical formula. So the only way that data could have got in the Bible is if the authors, the people who originally wrote it, knew advanced biology about decaying populations, they knew advanced mathematics, someone came up with a formula and then they passed that formula down for 2,000 years. Because that's data, it spreads over 2,000 years and 12 books of the Bible. Does that sound realistic? That someone faked it by doing that? Of course not. Now this is a graph that we're not going to discuss, but it's in a paper you can see by a guy called Professor Walter Makous from the University of Rochester. He was looking to see, is there any way that all these numbers in the Bible, spread out through 12 books of the Bible, could have they been fabricated? Could have they been faked? And he said he knows about numbers. He's a professor of cognitive and brain sciences, as well as a professor of visual science. He's quite clever. And he wrote this paper that you can see there, crunching the numbers, trying to see, is it likely that these were just made up numbers or not? He came to the same conclusion as the geneticist, but he did a lot more mathematically. And you can read his paper. It's really interesting. And he said, it's not proof. Of course, none of this is proof. It's happened in the past. We can't repeat it in a test tube in a laboratory. But he said that the mathematical properties of all those ages, that they fit natural numbers, they reliably do not fit fabricated numbers, and it's impossible to believe that someone at the beginning came up with a formula and they passed it all the way down along the line to make sure that whenever somebody else fabricated the numbers, they knew what number it was they should put there when someone died. So I think if you don't remember anything else, remembering this graph, remembering that there is real evidence that that is real, there's strong evidence that that is real, that shouts out that the Bible we got is a record of history that can be explained by science. Okay, enough of the maths. Let's do some fun things. One of the best ways to explain to people how reasonable it is to believe that we once lived for hundreds of years is to show them animals that still live for hundreds of years. So we've got a prop here. Shark, 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 baby shark, shark, shark. So, you can tell I've got a 2-year-old granddaughter, can't you? Baby shark, baby shark. So you can see up there's a picture of a shark with a green background. It's called Somniosus microcephalus. So what that means basically is it sleeps a lot and it's got a small head. And my wife pointed out that's why it's always smiling. It sleeps a lot and it's got a small brain. So Somniosus microcephalus, its common name is the Greenland shark. Now, it's about 5 metres from its snout to its tail. It's a big shark. Scientists caught 28 females, and they thought that most of them were at least 200 years old, and one of them was over 300 years old. Now compare that to the other sharks. The two on the side there, one's got a scuba diver, and the other shark has got a mouth open. That's our shark in our waters. That's called the great white pointer, Carcharodon carchariasis. It grows a little bit longer, about 6 metres from the fork of the tail to the snout. They only live about 60 years. So it's interesting, some organisms still live for very long periods of time compared to others. But the point is, it's not absurd to believe that big creatures can live for long periods of time. Now this one here is a coral. Have any of you ever snorkeled over coral? You won't ever snorkel over this coral. Of course, it's typically found about 1,400 metres down. So not all coral needs sunlight. These corals go anywhere from 300 metres to deep sea corals as a group. Corals that grow from 300 metres underwater to 3 kilometres underwater. So we're talking about a particular coral that's found off Hawaii called Laopathes grabarema. You don't have to remember that. All you have to remember is that this coral is still alive and it's said to be 4,200 years old. Now it's as complicated as you and I. In fact, it's really weird. It's got lots of heads and one body. I thought maybe I could come here tonight and wear a costume with all the little skulls, shrunken human heads. Maybe you'd find that interesting to watch as I presented the talk. But that's what a coral is, lots of heads on one body. But this body is meant to be 4,200 years old. It is a really complicated organism. And this one here, this is very small. This is a hydra. Now, Dr. Daniel Martinez, it's only about 10 millimetres. It's found in fresh water. He was given $1.2 million in US in 2010 to study them because they live so long, providing something doesn't eat them. He actually said that he believes that if nothing comes along and eats them, and they keep getting all their food that they want, that they are truly immortal, that they will really, truly live forever. And yet it too is made up of cells, and we've already seen how complicated cells are. So is it absurd to believe that we once lived for hundreds of years? I would say no. And I realise once again, some of you may know of people who have been in this predicament. So one side there looks like about 4 children. So they were all born with Hutchinson-Gilford syndrome. They were born, and this is about them at puberty. This is when they're about to die. So they're born and they have a generalised condition we call progeria. They age really fast. Their hair falls out, they get cataracts, they get a whole bunch of age-related diseases. So they're well and truly, they're typically dead before puberty. It's caused by a gene on chromosome 1, if that means anything to you. You know what a gene is though. And in 18 out of 20 kids born with this, there was only one letter mutated. Only one letter difference. Yeah, it's pretty sad. The one on the right, that's the same girl. So that's on, and you can see she looks young in black and white there. So that was when she was just before puberty. This disease, Werner's syndrome, only kicks in typically at puberty in a really big noticeable way, but they live to about 40. But as you can see, by the time they're 40, they're looking like they're about 80. Werner's syndrome is caused by a mutation in a gene on chromosome number 8. So this is pretty sad, isn't it? Why am I showing this? I'm showing it to you to help you see that genetically, ageing can be hastened. Isn't it reasonable to think that maybe all of us have mutations that have hastened our ages? You know, if you were Methuselah and Noah and looking at us, you would think that, why are you guys aging so quick? We look at these people with this terrible disease and we say to them, why are you aging so quick? So once again, there is a logical reason to believe that genetically we might all be carrying a huge mutation load. And getting back to why those men died after the flood, I didn't finish telling that story. How old was Noah when he had Shem, Ham and Japheth? 500. 500 years old when he had those 3 boys. Presumably one of them was first, they weren't triplets. But imagine how many photocopies of his sperm had been made by the time of that. And then there was only 8 survivors, Noah and his 3 male sons. So they could have carried an enormous amount of a genetic load of mutations, and hence the drop-off. And he did a lot of mathematical modelling and genetic modelling to show it fits. So that's why I'm showing you this screen here, to help you to see that ageing is something that is not just due to you wearing out. No one believes that. Well, most scientists don't believe it. They believe it's due to genetic and epigenetic changes. Maybe we'll talk about epigenetics another time. We talked before about how reasonable it is to believe that we can see a creator based on the complexity of our code. And we did that by comparing how atheistic scientists see one little spike in radio waves, and they think that they've seen intelligence. So what I've got there is a picture from a LinkedIn account of a professor, associate professor, Stanley Shostak. He wrote a book called The Evolution of Death. Now, he's an associate professor of biology. He wrote this book in 2006. He actually believes that one day through evolution, our bodies will be so brilliant, they'll have such great stem cells that we'll become immortal. So just when you think it might be a bit hard to convince your friends when they're reading the Bible the first time that we once all lived for 1,000 years, there's an evolutionary atheistic scientist saying, oh, but I think we're going to soon one day live for 1,000 years, ignoring the fact that all our genes are decaying. The good news, of course, for all of us that have given our lives to Jesus is that we will live forever. You know, Jesus talked in the New Testament how if anyone believes in him, even though they die, they will live. We all who have given our lives to Jesus know that one day that will be our reality. We will die, but then we'll get new bodies and we'll live on a new earth with God. We have great hope. So, in general, the world around us is a decaying world, and that seems to be the case with our genes. It's going from something perfect to rotting. If this decaying is real, where did it come from? Well, we said it was punishment. The question is this punishment fair? Is it fair punishment? Why did God punish the world that way? And how did it actually play out in this world? Part of it may be that God took away some of his sustaining power, and therefore we get these duplication errors in our DNA, and we end up with more and more mutations accumulating from one generation to the next. Some of it, though, seems to be that God deliberately made genes to introduce problems for our world as part of the punishment. Remember the thorns and thistles that only came about as a result of the punishment. So that's a case of God making deliberate genetic changes. So some of the punishment from the curse seems to have come about passively, maybe, some of it from active reasons, maybe a bit of both. Is there a fallout from all of this? Well, we've talked about one obvious fallout, and that is we're all getting old. And maybe we're all getting much older than we should be. Another fallout is that our genes are mutating, and this is a leading cause of cancers. In fact, all cancers are basically diseases caused by mutations. And I want to give this next part of the talk to help you appreciate the scale of the punishment. So, cancer globally is a leading cause of sickness and death. So in 2020, there are 19 million new cases of cancer just in that 1 year. 19 million. There are 10 million cancer deaths in 2020. It's a huge amount. Some research in 2023 showed that about 2/3 of the cancer types, because there are lots of types of cancers, or each cancer that comes from a different mutated cell gets a different name. 2/3 of them were due to mutation errors, that random mutation errors as the DNA gets copied, of the cancer types. 1/3 of cancers, though, relate to hereditary factors, what your parents gave you in terms of how good their genes were, and also lifestyle factors and dietary factors. And that's why I've got the picture of smoking there. Smoking causes about 2.5 million cancer deaths due to exposure of tobacco a year. So it's people's free will to smoke. It's people's free will to not educate as well as they should about the damage in some countries that smoking can cause. But that lot of cancer is coming from an act that people do to themselves. Alcohol causes about 5% of new cancer deaths. So there's this big, sad effect from the curse that we're seeing around us. I've lost 2 friends due to brain cancer in this last 12 months. Both of them due to rare brain cancer, one much younger than me, one my age. So cancer affects many of us. I know someone here in the audience has got a friend with cancer. And now you know, why do we have cancers? Well, because this world is a world that's been punished and it's decaying. There's a picture of an influenza virus there. You know, you got the flu, but it's not a common cold, it's a flu, it's influenza. You got aches and pains and a whole lot of bad fevers. In 1918, there was a pandemic called the Spanish flu. Is anyone aware of this pandemic? 1, 2, yeah. It was really bad. So 1918, World War II is ending in 1918, but this started before the war ended, World War I. In the first 4 months, it killed 21 million people. This is 1918, not 2018, so it's a huge chunk of the population. By the time the pandemic finished, in 4 waves it came through, by the time the final 4th wave finished, it was 1920, 50 million people died. And that organism was probably just a mutated flu virus from a bird flu, is one suggested theory. So once again, the burden of the punishment is immense. A good question to ask now is, well, why did God create the world? I've had people ask me this question. I've asked this question. If there's so much suffering in the world, and God being omnipotent knew all this suffering was going to happen, why did he do it? It's a very profound and very genuine question, very appropriate question. I've never heard a sermon on it, but the answer is quite simple. Who is God? God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, for all of eternity. John chapter 17, verse 24, Jesus talking to the Father about the love they enjoyed before the creation of the universe. Before any creation, what was there? Well, yes, there was a creator, but the creator was the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Some people say they lived in like a society. That's probably a too strong a word, but you get the picture. They were constantly in love and loving each other. Christianity, we have a God that in his very essence is a God of love. You can't have a God that is whose very essence is love if there is no love to give to anything, because there's nothing there. I mean, what was God doing before he created the universe? Well, if God was a single entity, like Allah in Islam, then what was he doing? Well, he certainly wasn't loving, because there was nothing to love. It couldn't have been something that was intrinsically part of his nature for all of eternity gone past. But what was our God doing? Our God was enjoying love. And it was such perfect love that they wanted to radiate and share that love with other creatures. That's why God made the world, to give this great love that they're enjoying to other creatures. It wasn't an experiment that went bad. It wasn't an experiment that they knew would go bad. They wanted some other creatures to enjoy their love. Did God need worshippers? Does a Christian God need worshippers? Certainly not. In other religions, their gods need worshippers. Some religions like Islam, basically people are just slaves to Allah. That's their main reason for existence. But our God doesn't need us to worship him, because for all of eternity before we were there, God was in perfect fellowship. So that's really important to understand why there is anything rather than just God. Another good reason, another question that comes up is, well, why this punishment? Was it maybe a bit too harsh? That's a fair question, especially if your wife is dying beside you or your kid was born with Werner's syndrome. Of course you'd be asking these questions. If you're living with a lot of pain, you might tell God, I don't like the way it is. But the good thing about the punishment is that death is ubiquitous. Everybody's going to die, and therefore there will be justice. For those of you who have come from war-torn countries, or maybe for those of you that have experienced people doing terrible things to you or your families, the good thing is one day there will be justice. If those perpetrators got away with it here, or the sentences are light, the good news is one day there will be justice. And of course, for those of us who have given our lives to Jesus, Jesus has taken our punishment. We can look forward to meeting Jesus the judge without a fear of punishment. And of course, we want this world to wind down. It's not a great place to be when there are people, even if people were living for 1,000 years and weren't much cancer, what were they doing to each other? Well, this is a very good question, isn't it? What does free will do? So God made Adam and Eve so they could freely choose to love him or not. That's the essence of human love, isn't it? You're free to do it. You're not forced to love. So this free will that we have that allows me to drink and drive, allows me to gamble my money at the casino, allows me to do all sorts of things, just surf all day and forget about everything else. I'd love to do that. these desires that we have, that God allows us to exercise them through free will. What does free will result in? Well, World War I, when influenza, the Spanish flu was going around, do any of you know how many people it killed? 16 million people in those 4 years. More civilians than soldiers, as usual for many wars. The USSR, so that we think of Russia now and all these other countries around it, but once there was this empire called the USSR, empire if you like, it was a communist country. The USSR was big from 1917 to 1987, absolutely huge. And then there's China that came along. So between 1917 and 1987, those two countries killed roughly 98 million of their own people. 98 million of their own people. This is free will. So as much as some people blame God in the way that he's punished this world, a lot of bad things happen because of our choices. If you're fortunate enough to live in the West and you know smoking's bad, if you still smoke, well, can you really blame God when you get cancer? Don't think so. There is another profound reason why the punishment gives us an aid to knowing God. If you look at that, you can see sadness. So that was due to the bombing in 2023 of a cathedral in Ukraine. Can you tell how ruined it is? Can you tell it once looked different? Yes. With a little bit of imagination, you can tell that that would have been once really grand. A really beautiful design. Probably lots of works of art and things like that. So even though there's decay, there is still evidence of masterful design. So our genes are decaying, our world is decaying, but you and I can easily see through all the stuff we've talked about tonight, and just looking at each other, looking at the flowers, sunflowers, all they do is eat dirt and they make sunflowers. Mangoes, an organism that eats dirt and makes mangoes. How cool is that? We see all this wonderful design and it points to a creator, because in general everything's going downhill. The big question is, given the weight of this suffering, can people still know that there's an all-powerful, all-loving God? And I just want to go through a few examples. Does anyone know this lady or listen to her music? Ginny Owens. So when she was 3, her progressive eye disease was so advanced that she could no longer see. So that would have been probably due to some sort of mutation load. Since she was 3. She loves Jesus. She wrote a book in 2021, I think it's called Singing in the Dark. I love the humour, if you like, or the poignancy of the title. She's totally blind, but she lives to tell people how good God is. She wrote, and this is a fairly accurate quote, I've never been mad at God because of my blindness. I had to read that several times. She's still a young woman. She's been perfectly blind since she's 3. I've never been mad because of my blindness, never been mad at God. She said, God gives, God takes away. I thought, I've heard those words somewhere before. She said, God is not stupid. I thought, I can't remember reading that in the Bible. God's perfect plan includes even me and my blindness. So she has no trouble believing in an all-powerful, all-loving God, despite bearing head-on the brunt of the curse. Has anyone seen this film, Beautifully Broken? Oh, it's a really powerful film. It is based on a true story. Just like I want you to remember the graph, I want you to go out and buy this film after you bought my book, called Beautifully Broken. In there's a story of a young teenage girl who gets raped. Watch the movie and see what happens to her life. But I can give you a spoiler alert. She doesn't finish her life full of hatred towards God. She knows that there's a loving, all-powerful God. It's a really powerful movie. We're going to watch a video very shortly of a guy called Scotty. I never met Scotty, but I know his dad. I only met his dad in recent times. So Gary, the father, had a son called Scotty. And Scotty helped make a film about himself. Scotty was born with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So this is a disease where the mutations that you're born with kick in terribly by the time you're 7. Their muscles start to fail. Basically, the disease means that the more your muscles work, the quicker they're going to break. So typically, about the age of 7, their muscles are starting to break down. So Scotty had this disease, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and certainly by the time he was 7, it was tough. I want you to watch this film, and then we're going to have a couple of short words after that. Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you. Scott Scotty died a couple of years ago, but he's a great example or an inspiration of how, even though you might be feeling the brunt of the curse, you can still know that Jesus is alive and well, that the all-powerful, all-living God hasn't disappeared just because this is a decaying world. So when times get rough, I hope you'll remember some of what we've talked about tonight, or at least some of the stories we've heard, and you'll hold them dear to your heart. This is how powerful Jesus is. He changes and transforms our life. Scotty, with his disability, wasn't living for himself. He was living for Jesus. He was aiming to help others, give joy to others, even though he was so disabled. If you truly love Jesus, if you truly believe that he's taken your punishment for you so that we can live with him with new bodies, then how much more should we all be trying to love him back? And because he is a God of love, then the amazing thing is he helps us to love him. I can't believe it that it's okay for me to tell Jesus, I need your help to love you more. If I told my wife that, she'd probably slap me appropriately. But anyway, this is the sort of powerful God we've got. If you don't know Jesus and you want to know more, then the pastor in your church and the Christians here, I'm sure, would be glad to talk to you. If you do know Jesus and you're going through some tough patches, it's really important you talk to others. Let's pray. You are our Father, not just our Creator. For all eternity, you've been a God of love. Oh, help me to love better. Help me to love you more. Thank you for shouting out to us that you're real, that you created this world, and that even though it's a punished and decaying world, there's no problem still seeing you. Thank you for all the examples of the people I know who have loved you right till death's door. Amen. Thank you, everybody.